The Keth Station Coalition Tactical Conference had been organized with the specific, thorough quality of a multilateral military event that had justified its own organizing committee. The 5 days of sessions planned down to their quarter-hour intervals. The amphitheater's seating assignments distributed by member delegation a week in advance. The technical briefing material formatted to the standards of 11-member species documentation requirements. Davan Mael had reviewed the conference materials on the transit from Vel-4 Station, which was what he did with conference materials. He read them, including the appendices, before the conference rather than during it, because reading them during it produced the specific, divided attention of someone who was managing the materials and managing the session simultaneously, and he preferred to give each the attention it deserved. He had been a tactical doctrine advisor for 14 months. Before that, he had been other things, which was the documentation's version of the 14 months before the advisor posting, which the documentation summarized in the specific clinical language of military records. Operational service, engagement history, medical status, discharge classification. He read the documentation the way he read all documentation, thoroughly and in the correct order, and had developed, across the 14 months of reading other people's documentation and reviewing his own, a specific, neutral relationship with the clinical language as a vehicle for the things it contained, which were sometimes larger than the language acknowledged, and which he had organized his relationship with accordingly. The uniform had been in the secondary transit case. The secondary transit case had been routed to Vel-4 Station by the relay system's cargo sort algorithm, which had misread the destination code in the way of algorithms that were correct in the aggregate and incorrect in the specific case, and which would resolve itself through the logistics office's correction request in the specific, unhurried timeline of a problem that was inconvenient rather than urgent. He had submitted the temporary uniform request through the conference's administrative office and had been told the request was processing. He had attended the morning briefing in the clothes he had, which were the clothes of someone who had packed for a 5-day working conference and had not anticipated needing them for a military planning session. The briefing amphitheater's third row had the specific, functional view of a position that could see the presentation materials clearly, and had a reasonable sight line to most of the other attendees, which was his preferred configuration in any briefing. He liked to be able to see who was in the room while he was listening to what was being said in it, because the room's personnel and the session's content were both information, and he preferred to have both available simultaneously. He took notes. He took them in the specific, methodical way of someone who was assessing what was being presented against what he already knew about the subject, which was how he took notes at all briefings, not transcribing but evaluating. The notes containing the assessments rather than the presentations, which meant his notes were useful to him in a way that transcriptions were not, because he already knew what had been presented, and what he needed was his thinking about it. Commander Tethkor was 2 seats to his left. Davan had noted him in the initial survey of the room. The Keth Combined Fleet's insignia on the dress uniform, the senior officer grade, the specific quality of someone who occupied their space in formal settings with the confident ease of someone who had been in enough formal settings to have stopped managing the occupation. Davan's assessment of him had taken approximately 30 seconds and had produced a provisional filing. Keth Combined Fleet, Senior Command, confident in context, assessing room. The assessing room quality had been the one that added a second annotation to the filing, which was, includes me in the assessment. This was not unusual. In civilian clothes without credentials visible on a uniform he did not have, being included in an assessment as an unknown quantity was the expected response from a competent officer. Tethkor's assessment had taken longer than 30 seconds. It had continued past the opening remarks. It had produced, at approximately 40 minutes in, a conclusion that Tethkor had decided to share. He said it to the colleague beside him. in the register that was loud enough to carry to the third row and quiet enough to be technically addressed to an adjacent officer rather than the room. Something about the apparent youth of some delegation's advisory personnel, and what it suggested about the relative seriousness with which different member species approached the coalition's work. Davan noted this in the specific, background accounting way he noted things. The assessment of the comment, the assessment of the commenter, the assessment of the appropriate response, which he arrived at quickly and which was no response, because the no response was the accurate communication of the comment's merit, and the responding response would have been the inaccurate one. He continued taking notes. At the 50-minute mark, Keth asked a question in the open session. He directed it at the room, which was the formal direction, and delivered it with the specific, rhetorical quality of a question that was not asking for information, but was making a point through the form of asking for it, the kind of question that was performing for an audience while pretending to address a subject. The subject was the Confederacy's advisory delegation's apparent approach to seniority in its appointment decisions. The point it was performing was, the human in civilian clothes looked young, and the looking young was evidence of the fraudulent or nepotistic nature of his credentials, and the evidence was available for the room to assess. Davan noted the question. He noted the specific, rhetorical quality of it. He noted the room's response to it, which was the response of a room watching something develop and having not yet determined where the development was going. He said, when the rhetorical pause arrived at the point that a response was clearly expected, the appointment is on the basis of operational record and doctrine development. Keth said, in the specific affable register of someone who was performing affability, and the record is significant, no doubt. Records on paper are thorough. The question is whether there has been significant time to accumulate one. Davan looked at him. He looked at him with the look that he used when he had completed his assessment, and the assessment was done, and there was nothing useful to add to it, and he said, "There has been sufficient time." "Sufficient," Keth said to his colleague in the same carrying but deniable register. A confident word for someone still young enough to find the chair comfortable. The room had the specific quality of a room that had decided something, and the something was that the human in the civilian clothes was either not responding, because he had nothing to respond with, or was not responding for a different reason, and the room had provisionally concluded the former, which was the wrong conclusion, and was the conclusion the room had reached because the information available to it was insufficient. Davan took notes. He took them with the same methodical focus as the preceding 50 minutes. He had opinions about Keth that he was maintaining professional silence about, which was the appropriate disposition of opinions that were accurate and not actionable in the current context. At the hour and 10-minute mark, Keth said, directly and without the pretense of addressing the colleague, that he had a procedural question for the Confederacy's advisory delegation, and wanted to understand whether the delegation's tactical doctrine advisor had operational experience or had come to the posting through the administrative track. Davan said yes. Keth said that yes was not a number, and numbers were what gave weight to a yes. The room had the quality of 200 people who had arrived at the wrong conclusion and were sitting in it. Fleet Commander Vel-4 had been in the front row since the session's opening. She had the specific, front row quality of someone who had chosen the front row deliberately rather than ended up there. The position of someone who wanted the clearest sight line to the presented materials and was willing to be visible in order to have it. She was Vel-4, which Davan had noted in the initial room survey and the specific way he noted things. Vel-4 First Combined Fleet, Fleet Commander grade, front row, monitoring room as well as briefing. The monitoring room quality had been visible since the start, and he had noted it the way he noted things that were present and did not require immediate response. She had been monitoring the third row for approximately 40 minutes. She stood. The room's attention reorganized toward her in the specific, reflexive way that rooms reorganized towards significant authority when it made itself available, not the performance of authority, which was what some people produced when they wanted rooms to attend to them, but the other kind, the kind that was present because the person was present, and the presence was simply what it was. She looked at Keth. She said, in standard, in the carrying register of the amphitheater's acoustics used by someone who understood the acoustics. Commander, before you continue, I want to ensure you understand who you are speaking to. Keth looked at her with the expression of someone who had not expected the front row to enter the developing situation and was recalibrating. She said, "The Confederacy's tactical doctrine advisor is Vanguard 7. She said the designation in the Confederacy's full formal form, which was the form that military officers of Keth Corps' grade and experience in the outer Confederacy systems were expected to recognize, because the designation was in the coalition's shared military intelligence documentation that all member forces above a certain grade were supposed to review. She watched Keth Corps' expression do the specific, visible work of a person receiving a designation and checking it against the file the designation was supposed to index and either finding the file or not finding it. She said, for the room, Grid Epsilon, 14 months ago, the Kresh assault on the outer Verath defensive perimeter. The grid was the last position between the assault and the civilian evacuation corridor. The grid's defensive line held for 14 hours after every other defender at the position was killed. She said this in the flat, precise register of a military account being delivered factually rather than rhetorically. The human tactical doctrine advisor held that position. The coalition's military analysis of the engagement produced the defensive doctrine that is now in the coalition's standard officer curriculum. The Keth Combined Fleet's officer training program includes it in the third-year tactical systems module. Keth had the expression of someone whose processing was running. She said, "The scars that are not visible because human regenerative medicine is sufficiently advanced to rebuild what the 14 hours produced, which is the specific irony of a species whose medicine makes their warriors look younger than their record indicates. The operational record that you have been characterizing as insufficient is the record of someone whose body count in that single engagement exceeds your career total." She said this last thing in the same flat register, not a point scored, a fact presented. His tactical innovations are studied at your own academy, Commander. I would suggest the morning's conversations proceed with that information. She sat down. The room had the quality of 200 people revising a conclusion simultaneously. Keth had the expression of someone who had received significant information and was in the specific, internal accounting of someone who was arriving at the size of the error they had been making, and the size was larger than the accounting had initially produced. Davan looked at his notes. He looked at them in the specific, focused way of someone who was continuing the thing they had been doing, which was the thing they had come to do, which was what the conference was for. He did not look at Keth. He did not look at the fleet commander. He took notes for the remainder of the session in the same, methodical way he had been taking them when the day started, because the notes were the reason he was at the conference, and the session was continuing, and the afternoon had an agenda that the morning's record was going to be relevant to. He found her in the corridor during the midday interval. Not by arrangement. The conference center had specific corridors that connected the amphitheater to the dining facility and the documentation offices, and the fleet commander was in the documentation office corridor, reviewing the afternoon agenda on her device when he came through on his way to the dining facility. And the corridor was the corridor, and it did not require arrangement to be what it was. She looked up when he approached. He said, "I was managing the situation." She said, "I know. The intervention changed the room's dynamics," he said. "That is going to require work for the rest of the conference." "Yes," she said. "Those are both complaints about the intervention," he said. "I know," she said. "They are accurate." He looked at her, And you intervened anyway. You were approaching the threshold, she said. I have read the Grid Epsilon after-action reports. The detailed version, not the summary. I know what the threshold looks like from the documentation. I know what is on the other side of it. A coalition tactical conference is not the appropriate venue for the other side of it. He was quiet for a moment. I was not at the threshold, he said. She looked at him with the full, direct Solvari attention, the complete, undivided quality of a species for whom looking was a different thing than it was for species who had developed looking as a partial attention act. No, she said. You were approximately 40 minutes from it. I have good pattern recognition. He thought about this. The after-action reports, he said, the detailed version. I am the fleet commander who petitioned the commission to declassify the detailed version for multi-species distribution, she said. The summary version was insufficient for implementation purposes. The doctrine required the full operational context. He looked at her. You are the reason it is in the Keth training curriculum, he said. I am one of the reasons, she said. The doctrine recommended itself. I provided the initial advocacy. I did not know that, he said. You were in rehabilitation when the advocacy was happening, she said. The timing was not designed for your awareness. He was quiet in the specific way of someone receiving information that reorganized a part of the context they had been carrying without the full picture. The corridor was doing its midday interval business around them. The attendees moving between the amphitheater and the dining facility and the documentation offices. The specific, ambient noise of a significant event at the pause between its morning and afternoon. The intervention, he said, it was not for me. It was not only for you, she said. It was for the conference's operational function. And for Keth Core, who is a better officer than his performance this morning indicated, and who needed the correction before he crossed a threshold of his own that he would not have recovered from professionally. He considered this. And the threshold, he said, and the threshold, she said, yes. He looked at her, he said, you have read the detailed after-action reports. Yes. Then you know Grid Epsilon better than most people who were not there. I know the documented version, she said. The documented version is thorough, he said. I know. She looked at him. There are things that are not in the documented version. Yes, he said. I know that also, she said. He looked at the corridor. He said, the afternoon session is in 40 minutes. Yes, she said. The conference has a dining facility that serves between sessions, he said. It does. The things not in the documented version, he said. Yes. I don't discuss them in conference settings, he said. I know, she said. I discuss them occasionally in other settings. She looked at him with the full, direct attention, and the expression that the morning and the corridor and the calculation and the detailed after-action reports had produced in it, which was the expression of someone who had known the documentation and had found the difference between the documentation and the person, and was in the particular quality of someone who understood that the difference was significant and was not going to be resolved in 40 minutes. The dining facility, she said. Yes, he said, and after the afternoon session. The conference has 5 days, she said. Yes, he said. The things not in the documented version are not all contained in 40 minutes. No, she said. They would not be. Then 5 days is the relevant timeline, he said. She looked at him. She said, 5 days is sufficient. He looked at the corridor. He looked at her. He said, the intervention this morning, thank you. I told Keth Core what he needed to know, she said. That was the function. Yes, he said, and thank you. She looked at him for a long moment in the full, complete way. She said, you were managing the situation. I was, he said, and it was taking longer than it should have, and the room was arriving at conclusions that were going to require correction. He paused. So thank you. She said, you are welcome. In the briefing amphitheater, the afternoon session's materials were being organized by the conference staff in the specific, efficient way of people who ran multi-day events and knew the interval between sessions, was the interval in which the next session was prepared rather than the interval in which preparation happened eventually. In the front row, Keth was reviewing his formation work documentation, with the focused quality of someone preparing to have a conversation that was going to be different from the one he had expected when the day started, and which was going to be better for the difference, because the morning had distributed information that the afternoon was going to use, and accurate information produced better conversations than incomplete information, which was a principle that applied to tactical planning and to most other things. The dining facility served between sessions,